Hi, so here is part one of our discussion regarding Module 6, Unit 7, and multicultural education and gifted education. Um, let me just listen a few things. This has been one of the craziest weeks ever. Um, Anywho, okay, so I like Donna Ford. She is a big advocate for gifted education. She focuses in on Black and Hispanic students' lack of representation within gifted education programs around the country. This article I think is important to consider because um, it gives us something to think about and expand our knowledge on how our programs are represented and also how they are preparing our students. So let's get started. So she starts off with a really good overview. The underrepresentation of Black and Hispanic students in gifted education is meaningful and statistically significant. And I would expand that beyond Black and Hispanic students and include all those who are not represented within a gifted education program. ELL, ESL students, and that doesn't just mean students who are speaking Spanish. It means students who speak any language that's non-American or not English, who are not represented within gifted education program because we don't provide services for them in a way that allows their gifts to come forth in their learning environments. For example, she says as of 2006, the most recent data for which federal statistics are available, Black students are underrepresented by 48%, more specifically, 253,000 more Black students should be identified as gifted. Likewise, Hispanic students are underrepresented by 38%, resulting in another large number of students who are not accessing gifted education curriculum programs and services. It's hard to diagnose a student as gifted and talented if they're not in a classroom, right? So we all know that in most of these cases, underrepresented students have other challenges that they're facing within the environment. They either have a hard time related to the content, relating to the teacher, relating to the environment, and oftentimes they get lost in the shuffle. So this data is no surprise to me. But what leads to that are sometimes often teacher-centered and teacher-directed. So, and some of these things are systematic and other of these things are individualized as I explained in the introduction kind of announcement of this module. This is not a personal attack on any of us as educators, including myself in that conversation, but it is a thought into how these ideologies, these ways of thinking contribute to the lack of diversity within gifted education programs. So, for example, deficit thinking. Deficit thinking is grounded in the belief that culturally different students are genetically and culturally inferior to white students. It is a belief that their cultural belief, values, language, practices, customs, traditions, and more are substandard, abnormal, and unacceptable, which means that you think of them as kind of less than, not you meaning you, but the thought, the ideology behind deficit model means that you have a ideology that devalues or lessens the person who has the diverse culture. And obviously, if that mindset is present within the teaching component or even within the perspective of the person being the guard of the determining factor of who goes into gifted and talented programs, they're not going to make it in because obviously this is a devaluing of the skills that the student could bring based on their race or their ethnic background, if it's not of the majority. And then it says, when deficit thinking exists, educators are unable to focus on the strengths and potential of Hispanic and African American students, kind of like what I said. They are blinded instead by low expectations and stereotypes. So hence the low referral rates of Black and Hispanic students for gifted education screening and placement. She said, as she has proposed and argued throughout her career, deficit thinking is a systematic problem. that influences all aspects of gifted education. So, definitions of theories, instruments, selected criteria, policies and procedures, curriculum and instruction, relationships, and placement. So, it's not just about one individual teacher, it's about a system of approaches that have identified underrepresented students from a deficit model of thinking that then decreases their ability to even be placed into the gifted education program. Next term, color-blinded ideology. And I'm going through the actual reading so you can see I'm breaking down the terms, but I'm going through the actual article so that it's easier to kind of just understand these terms. Color-blindedness, also referred to as culture blindness, is another systematic barrier to redressing underrepresentation. She says the philosophy and practice exists when educators or individuals intentionally or unintentionally suppress the importance of and role of culture in learning, curriculum, instruction, assessment, and expectations. And this often happens because sometimes we are a part of a shared norm. We are, most of us are American citizens. If we're not, we live in American culture to a certain extent, and oftentimes forget that there are other cultures in the world. And I'm not just talking about by race, I'm talking about the exposure of the world, exposing students to content that maybe presents a different perspective versus the American history. Or I remember one year I did a series of books of coming of age in different countries. So we visited Shanghai in our book, and we learned that, for the first 2 years, students all learn Mandarin before they go to primary school, or during their first 2 or 3 years of primary school, because this is the language of China. But the point that I'm making is that we have to intentionally include the stories of other cultures within every aspect of students' learning, because when we don't do that, it's kind of like we're integrating a colorblind ideology, meaning that we're the only people that exist, and that color for America is as I guess white European American ideology. So it's not just a person, it's it's an ideology that is a part of being an American. But it matters just as much as anything else, as far as exposure, right? So if we never talk to students about technology, we would be giving them shortchanging them on media literacy and the accuracy that they need to be able to explore and expand their knowledge about technology. So when we approach curriculum, when we approach programs from a colorblind mindset, we don't take into consideration how and why and what we need to do to make sure that underrepresented groups are a part of certain programming. How do systematic approaches to identifying different groups of folks who are from diverse backgrounds, how does that play a role into their qualifying or not qualifying? So these are certain things that you should be considering when you think about colorblind ideology. Also, that colorblindedness is often equated with being fair but not seeing differences and treating everyone the same. So that's just as worse, because we're not all the same. We are diverse, and that's why I love this picture, because all of us are different. Even people who look like us, we're different from each other. So it's important that we recognize the difference, and not in a tolerant way, but recognize the difference in a way of being able to value the uniqueness that we all bring to any situation, especially when it comes to selecting gifted students. She also says, stated another way, if we believe that gifted students are the same as all other students, there would be no need for a gifted education program and services, which I think is kind of crazy that we don't have government or federal mandates that there are fundings for gifted education programs, just like special education, because it's necessary. This is not the case. Gifted students are like other students, but they are also different. That's why they need additional funding. So this too is the case with culturally different students, as learned from cultural anthropologists and cultural psychologists. For example, they are like white students, but also different. So we have to recognize that although, we may all ascribe to different parts of American culture, but we still are integrated within this culture, bringing our own ethnicities and our own cultural backgrounds. Then the next term of white privilege, which I think we all suffer from a little bit, especially since we are economically so different from our students as educators. White privilege is equally problematic and contributes to the poor presence of Black and Hispanic students in gifted education. As described by McIntosh, white privilege is unearned benefits that advantage whites while disadvantaging others. White privilege is deeply embedded in the structural fabric and cultural workings. That's why I said structural, cultural, meaning that we share an American culture and we have a privilege over over certain things that you don't think about when you think about culture difference. Like I remember my sisters talking about being in Haiti when she was a undergrad. She did a internship, and power was was something that was not a normal. It went out frequently, while we are kind of used to having access to power outlets and having a surge of power. That's a privilege of being in America. So white privilege is deeply embedded in the structural fabric and cultural workings. It is a form of entitlement and affirmative action in which the social and cultural capital, language, values, customs, traditions of white Americans is valued and held as normal, normative, or the standard. So white privilege looks at an inability for us to kind of go beyond us, meaning Americans, specifically people who are European descent or those who choose to be colorblinded. When they get to live in a privilege, when they don't have to acknowledge the fact that there are different cultures in the classroom, that they too have a culture, and also that that there are differences of value within a classroom that actually matter. So according to Sue 2008, white privilege operates in an invisible veil of unspokenness and secrecy, confers dominance to one group and owes its existence to white supremacy, and is based on the mistaken notion of individual meritocracy and individualism. So if you look at the picture, I thought this was a good way to summarize it. So over here, she has to run through puddles, miles, bricks, and walls, and he has a few laps and the things that you see, you know what I'm talking about. He has a few hurdles to crawl over, and that's about it. That's pretty much white privilege. And he goes, what? What's the matter? Is this the same distance? It might be the same distance, but how we have to get there, what comes out, what barriers, what struggles. When we look at white privilege, when we look at a deficit thinking model, when we look at colorblindness, it is our inability to see how structural things may inhibit the growth and development of others. So for example, if you have a student who's always tardy and they happen to be Hispanic but they're brilliant, and we have truancy requirements that say you have to write that student up, what can we do to leverage the fact that of their brilliance? How can we reshape and reformat our classrooms to ensure that, yes, they may be truant, they may have consequences, but how do we then still ensure that their talents are not lost, because it is complicated. In other cultures, everyone doesn't have an American dominance where, if their family members got sick, they didn't have to go to another country for a couple of weeks to be with that family because that's their culture. How do we ensure that everyone's treated fairly? Well, the secret is to not buy into the systematic approaches of creating those barriers. And then here's a little bit more information for you. Underrepresentation, a brief overview of the past. So just remember there's no one variable or factor that is responsible for underrepresentation. Instead, a confluence of factors is at work. So it includes families, educators, decision makers, and peers who contribute to the disproportionate amount of gifted students from underrepresented groups. And then our last few slides here. And then I have a video for you. Recommendations for change. So how do we go towards change? The article kind of sums up a few things that you might want to consider. Aim for equitable representation towards the future. How do you do that? Join the fight to close the achievement gap. Intentionally look for students who are underrepresented, who you don't see, who you know are talented, and they just need exposure to maybe APA or AP courses, magnet programs. Maybe they need someone to say that person's brilliant. I recommend them for this program. I recommend them for this. Examine data by race, gender. Examine data by income and decrease using income as proxy for race. Because it's not determined by that. I always used to laugh and say the hood is not just full of black people. There are a variety of races. It's economic status. So there's no particular group of people who fall under poverty. Poverty is a condition by which you simply don't earn enough to be of a status of anything above that. You earn less than a working I would say blue collar working American who's making a certain income. And there's a lot of people who fall on the poverty line who are not of one race. And then focus on early identification and talent development. Look at underrepresentation. Be reasonable about what is unreasonable and inequitable. You can go back over that a little bit further. Also, consider the definitions and theories. They must be culturally responsive, meaning that consider integrating definitions and theories of what it means to be gifted and talented, centering it into culturally responsive or multicultural education perspectives. Consider policies and procedures. Some rules may need to be broken. I saw that and I said, I don't want to advertise for that. However, I will say that some policies, as far as like the truancy situation, maybe working something out within a school for the student who is gifted and brilliant, but has a family dynamic at home that they can't bypass. Testing and assessment. Stop hiding behind objectivity. Try to expand what the qualifiers are for people who are integrated into gifted education programs. And then I'm going to click on this. It's a video that I thought was super cool for us to see. So let me just give me a moment to bring it over. And Control V, enter. So this is on culturally responsive teaching. I have a plethora of stuff on it, but I'm going to show you this story here.
Again, like it reaffirms what I'm saying. No matter how hard it is for us to understand, or it's uncomfortable because it's out of our comfort zone and we don't know everything about it, it's so important that we put books in our kids' hands that are direct reflections of themselves. Okay, what was your name of that? Today's class was about building a student-centered, culturally relevant curriculum. This is a super powerful book, especially for our refugee students. Nobody on the front looks the same, which is like Hibbard. At Hibbard, we have students of all different cultural backgrounds, all different linguistic abilities and backgrounds, and we needed to kind of revamp everything so that our students were front and center rather than a curriculum being front and center. So we decided that we were going to go with our own curriculum that we created, and we've worked a lot of culturally relevant texts in there so that our students have the opportunity to see themselves as characters in books as well as learn about each other's culture through literacy. This one, a story about a kid who crosses the river and he's here from Mexico and his struggles in school, all written in bilingual poems. So we had to have this for every single teacher, and we did a huge PD with it. And it was with incoming teachers, we want to express the importance of this because it's kind of a shift that a lot of schools are making. We're seeing more diverse populations. Some point, the majority of them have not known how to communicate with classmates because of a language barrier. So this is amazing too. And we want to be able to adjust our teaching practice as that goes. So by teaching them about it now, I feel like we're better equipping them to go into diverse schools when they graduate and become teachers.
So, culturally responsive teaching is literally being aware of other cultures outside of yours. It means integrating those differences and that knowledge of difference into your practice of teaching. And that's something I work really, really hard on because that was one of the major hiccups that I had when I first came here to teach. I had forgotten that just because students may appear to be from familiar groups of people that I knew, that I still needed to be culturally responsive in my teaching practices. So it is something to work at, and it is a challenge, but it is achievable. Final thoughts: when curriculum is rigorous and multicultural, culturally responsive, then more Black and Hispanic students will be engaged and motivated. With engagement and motivation comes performance. With higher performance or achievement comes greater representation and gifted education. All of this weighs heavily on educators working to decrease, eliminate, and or reduce the effects of deficit thinking, color blindness, and white privilege. I have added a resource in the back here for you, but all in all, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. This was a challenging one for me, as oftentimes I think about best ways to state and propose certain ideas, but we're getting there. We have one more lecture to go with this one, so stay tuned for the next lecture coming up shortly.